Welcome to another episode of Remember the Great Sports NBA 2K20 roster edits. Today I'm going to do what is known as the modern day Washington Wizards. However, the Wizards are also known as the Washington Bullets, the Baltimore Bullets, but even before that, the Chicago Packers and the Chicago Zephyrs. That's a long list of team names to put in a title, so we're just going to call this the all-time Washington Bullets and Washington Wizards roster. So, NBA 2K20 actually did a really good job with the stock roster, and that's what you're looking at right here. The stock roster actually has some additions that were not on the roster last year, and this is the stock roster, so I'm just going to show you the names on the roster, and we'll go from there. So, Elvin Hayes, Wes Unseld, Gilbert Arenas, John Wall, Moses Malone, Earl the Pearl, Caron Butler, Phil Chenier, Rod Strickland, Bradley Beal, Chris Webber, Antawn Jamison, Jeff Malone, Larry Hughes, Bernard King. Alright, so I have a couple additions to this roster. Two of them are Hall of Fame basketball players that are not on the game. Also, one may be a Hall of Famer someday when it's all said and done. So, let me just tell you the ones that I recommend deleting off of this roster. And again, to remind the viewers, these are just my personal roster updates. If you don't agree with, the deletions and the additions, you're more than welcome to make them to your liking. This is just how I like to play the game, to update my rosters, to give the all-time greatest, best players for each team. The first person to leave the team is Larry Hughes. Hughes was a good player. However, he kind of bounced around quite a bit. He was with the Bullets, or the Wizards, only for 3 seasons. So that's pretty much why he's going to leave the team. Second, Rod Strickland. Again, Strickland was a very good player for the Bullets. However, he wasn't there that long. I mean, he played there. As you can see, he bounced around quite a bit in his career. But he was with Washington for about 4.5, 5 seasons. But, he played for the Trailblazers, the Spurs, the Knicks, on down the list. And again, great player. But when you have a team that already has Earl the Pearl, John Wall, and Gilbert Arenas, do you really need a 4th point guard? And finally, the last one that I'm going to delete, and this one may not be a popular one, is Hall of Famer Moses Malone. And the only reason I go there is because, again, Malone's heyday, he was only with the Bullets for 2 seasons. And I have a Hall of Fame center that spent a lot more time with the franchise than Moses Malone, and I'll get right to that guy here in a second. So, alright, so here are the first changes to the new Washington Wizards / Bullets lineup. And your starting point guard, Gilbert Arenas. Again, this is who the starting point guard is by default on the game. However, if you prefer John Wall over Gilbert Arenas, that's to your own liking, I guess. But John Wall, Gilbert Arenas, I feel are pretty much can flip around and they can, be either or. Now, this is the first move that I made. This is not a roster, deletion or addition. This is actually a position change. Earl the Pearl Monroe, which is where Earl the Pearl had his biggest success before he came to the Knicks. He was a point guard, but he also played shooting guard later on in his career. So I simply moved Earl the Pearl to shooting guard, so you pretty much have 2 ball handlers in the lineup at the same time. Obviously, with Monroe being the more prolific scorer, he'd be a great shooting guard addition to the team. So change Earl Monroe from point guard to shooting guard on your starting lineup. Now, this is the first person to be created and added to the team, and he's kind of hard to see there, but I want to make sure I got all his name on the screen there. His name's Gus Johnson. And a lot of you may not know who Gus Johnson is. He actually is a Hall of Famer. He played for the Baltimore Bullets back in their heyday. He played for a couple other teams like the Pacers as well. But he played in the 1960s. He played his college basketball at the University of Idaho, also Boise State. I think he played both places, if I'm not mistaken. But the reason you don't know Gus Johnson is that he passed away at a very, very young age from a brain tumor, brain cancer, and he was only in his late 40s when he passed away. However, he was inducted into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame in 2010, I believe. But Gus Johnson's the perfect small forward in this situation, being he's a Hall of Famer. The guy averaged about 16 points a game for his career, but he also played some defense. So he's a good three-man to put on the scoring small forward. He can play some defense. He also can chip in, about 15 points a game. And I think it's necessary to have him as the starting small forward on this team. So leading to the starting power forward, probably one of the most successful players ever in the history of the Bullets franchise, Elvin Hayes. Elvin Hayes, as you know, also played for the Houston Rockets, but he also had some huge success with the Washington Bullets in the heyday of his career, bringing them a championship, then of course going back to the Rockets to end his career. With that being said, Wes Unseld, the Hall of Famer at the starting center position, backed up by another Hall of Famer, and this is another addition to the list, and this is why Moses Malone is not on the team, and that is Walt Bellamy. Walt Bellamy goes back to the Chicago Packers and the Chicago Zephyrs before they moved to Baltimore to become the Baltimore Bullets. But Walt Bellamy was a young player from the University of Indiana, probably next to Isaiah Thomas, one of the greatest players ever to go through the University of Indiana. And he had a lot of success with the Bullets, but later on moved on to the Atlanta Hawks, and I want to say also the New York Knicks later in his career. Walt Bellamy, very formidable backup center that replaces Moses Malone on the team. John Wall, we already discussed him, and Gilbert Arenas. Bradley Beal. Now, I knocked Bradley Beal out of the starting rotation for Earl the Pearl Monroe. However, if you're a Bradley Beal fan and you feel he's better than Earl the Pearl, you definitely just leave Earl the Pearl as another point guard. However, with John Wall on the team, Earl Monroe and John Wall will be trying to share some minutes. So I wouldn't recommend that, but if you like to play small ball, this might be the way to go. Chris Webber as a backup power forward. Initially, I was a little hesitant to keep him on the team. However, he did have some pretty successful years as the Bullets. It's just, he's more remembered being a Sacramento King, maybe even a Golden State Warrior. But if you look at his stats, he spent 4 years. I try to only use guys that have 3 or more years, and he fits the criteria of having 4, but he averaged over 20 a game, which I think is very formidable for a good power forward / center backup. So this could be a backup center as well on the roster. Backup small forward, Caron Butler. Caron Butler, he had some pretty successful years with the Washington franchise. As you can see, he played 4.5 years there. Good swingman. I wouldn't put him above Gus Johnson, but he's a good backup to Gus Johnson. I wouldn't have him in my starting lineup, though, where I think the game does. And I'd rather have a Hall of Famer like Gus Johnson in the starting lineup. But Butler makes the team as a good backup small forward. Phil Chenier, this is probably one of the greatest Washington Bullets that is overlooked. A lot of people don't remember Phil Chenier, but he was on a long time with Washington, as you can see. And, he's another one of those guys that can play shooting guard and run the point, very similar to Earl the Pearl Monroe. A very good backup shooting guard, backup shooting guard, point guard. So there's your replacement to Rod Strickland. You don't really need Rod Strickland if you're going to have Phil Chenier on your bench, because he can play both the point and the shooting guard position. Finally, Antawn Jamison. He had some very formidable years as well with the Washington Wizards. Might have been a Bullet too, I don't remember. But as you can see, he averaged over 20 a game most of the seasons, and he's a good power forward, small forward type. So if Gus Johnson and Caron Butler aren't cutting it for you, you could always throw him in at the 3 position at forward and let him play the small forward. Being said, you also have this guy. This is Bernard King. Bernard King, as you know, was a huge star with the New York Knicks. He tore up his leg, had to come back from multiple surgeries and rehab, but he did that with the Washington Bullets. He never was the player that he was on the Knicks, but he did have some very, very good seasons. As you can see, he averaged 28.4 a game in 90-91 for the Bullets. And, you know, you can see that even though he had that break in time, trying to rehab and come back from injuries, he had 4 very good seasons with the Bullets. So this is a great guy to have on the bench. He can play small forward. You can even plug him in at shooting guard, but you really don't need to on this team. But, you know, maybe if you feel like you're oversized or overmatched at the shooting guard with Monroe, this might be a guy you could plug in there and play some Monroe if that's, you know, what you'd like to do. So perfect 13th man. Now, that bumps Jeff Malone down to the reserve list. Jeff Malone, like Phil Chenier, very good offensive player. However, kind of undersized for a forward, but he's a good shooting guard, and you can see the stats here. But he's definitely staying on the list as one of the all-time best Bullets, and that adds my last addition to the team, and this is why I decided to part ways with basically Moses Malone. Well, not really. Larry Hughes, I guess you would say. And that was in favor of Juwan Howard. Now, Juwan Howard, teammate of Chris Webber at Michigan in college, part of the Fab Five. Juwan Howard was kind of a, you know, I don't want to say journeyman, but he had a very long NBA career playing for the Miami Heat, playing for the Dallas Mavericks, on down the list. But probably his best years, if you look at his stats, were as a Washington Bullet. So this is one of those guys that can play either the power forward or small forward position, and I think this is a good addition to the lineup. I was, you know, debating on throwing another center in there, like Marcin Gortat or somebody like that, but ultimately I went with Juwan Howard because I feel like having the 15th man on the roster, you could really pick a lot of people to be that, but I chose to go with Juwan Howard. So finally, the coach, Shue. A lot of people may not know Shue, but he is a former player that played in the 1950s and 60s. He later went on to become the coach of the Washington or Baltimore Bullets, and that's the most winningest person in the franchise's history. So I made Shue the head coach of this team. So hopefully you guys do a little research and look him up. And I put the assistant coach as Scott Brooks, the current coach of the team. So in closing, I hope you agree with this lineup changes. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and have fun playing NBA 2K20.